Okay, we are in Second Kings. Well, we're in Second Kings 8, Second Chronicles 21, and we just finished up Ahab and all the issues that he was dealing with, and we're now into Ahab's son's reign. At which point now we start to see some of the if you want to say the bills come due, if you will. Uh, Before we do, let's see if we can do this. All right, we'll start with the hard ones. Kings of Israel. All right, who's the first king of Israel? Jeroboam, then Nadab, then the one we never talk about. He's hard. Baasha, yeah. Then the one who's really never around is Elah. Uh, then we've got Elah being assassinated by Zimri, 7 days, and he's replaced by Omri. Now it gets easier. We got Omri, and then his son is Ahab, and then Ahab's son is Amaziah and Ahaziah. The easy way to remember this is that well, I don't know if it's easier, but in Israel you got Ahaziah and then Jehoram. In Judah you're going to have Jehoram and then Ahaziah. So their order is switched. So there's that. But there's another trick for Judah, and we'll talk about that in a second. So the kings of Judah, there's they're a little bit more organized, at least in the structure. You start with who? Rehoboam. Next up is Abijam. Then after Abijam, you got Asa, and then Jehoshaphat. After Jehoshaphat, Jehoram, and then Ahaziah. Okay. By the way, you can always remember it's Ahaziah, Amaziah is after him, and then Azariah is after him. So if you ever wonder if you get them confused, which one is which, because they basically they're not right after each other. But if you get switched up, you always remember they go in alphabetical order. So that makes it a little bit easier. So if you remember back in First Kings 19, this is back when Elijah was despairing of his life. He was frustrated. He's called out to the mountain, and God appears to him there, and God tells him to do some different things. And if you remember, he was told to anoint three different people. Who was he supposed to anoint? Do you remember? First Kings 19. One was his successor. So who's Elijah's successor? Elisha. So that's the easy one. There's two other kings that he's supposed to. No, not quite. Hazael. And who was he king of? Aram. Which is also Syria. If you see Aram or Aram or however you pronounce it, that's basically Syria. And then you got the third guy he's supposed to anoint, which is Jehu, and he's going to be over Israel. So Elijah is told to do this. It's been some time since that's happened, but now Ahab is passed on. His son is on the throne, and if you remember, why is all this happening after Ahab has died? Do you remember? It's been a couple of weeks since we talked about this, but do you remember why? Why didn't God visit all this wrath and vengeance on Ahab while he was king? Do you remember? Sorry. Well, yeah, he had his idolatry and he was doing all these things, but God said, "I'm not going to visit on you. I'm going to visit on your son's generation." Why was it not on Ahab? Do you remember? What did Ahab do to divert that? When Elijah came to him and condemned him after the story of Naboth and his vineyard, what was Ahab's response to that? He humbled himself, right? Now, how sincere he was, don't know. It doesn't appear that it lasted particularly long, but because he was willing to at least show publicly for the nation to see that he had submitted his will to God, God was willing to say, "All right, because he has done that, I'm not going to visit this punishment on his days. I'm going to visit on his children's days." Now, having said that, Ahab still dies in battle because he again continues to be rebellious. He continues to refuse to listen to God, and as a result of that, he's going to be killed in the battles with in the battle of Syria. And so that brings us into where we are today. And I wanted to bring back the timeline just to kind of remind everybody where we are, just to give us a little bit of a perspective. Uh, we're in this is a point of about 130 years between 853 BC, which is where we are now. Ahaziah is the king over Israel, and 723, and that's the date when Israel is eventually going to fall to the Assyrian Empire. All right. We can add in the Jewish kings here, the kings of Judah here to kind of give you a little context. It's um it's a little hard to see, but at least this way you kind of get an idea of their order and how they overlap. And I added in at the bottom just to give you an idea of some of the prophets. We're going to bring in some of the minor prophets in the as we get closer to the end, because I want to be able to show how some of those minor prophet writings tie into what we're reading about in First and Second Kings and Second Chronicles. I think it's generally helpful to be able to understand what those books are talking about. But Elisha, if you'll notice, is alive during this time up until around the time somewhere in Jehoash's reign, because that's when Elisha ends up dying. If you remember, I think I don't think we read the story this week. I think we read it last week, where Elisha is dying and Jehoram actually goes to see him. And Elisha tells him to go. Do you remember the story? He tells him to go take your bow and arrow, or no, he's no, you take these arrows and strike them against the floor. And you remember he does it 3 times, and Elisha gets upset at him because why did you do that? If you had done this 5 times, you could have fully destroyed Syria and taken away. But because you've only done it 3 times, you're going to only defeat Syria 3 times. So in Elisha's death, he promises Jehoash that they're going to be able to defeat the Syrians 3 times before that time of trouble is going to start coming back again. And you're going to start seeing that now in this time. Um, we're not quite to the point where we have Jonah and Amos and some of these others. So right now, we're in this time period right here, between 853 and down to around probably 820 or so. And you can see there's a lot that's going on. A lot of people that are going to be overthrown. So it brings us into the story of Jehoram. Excuse me. We won't spend a lot of time on him, but what do we know in the readings? How is Jehoram described? What kind of a king is he? He's evil. Um, what's one of the things that we read about that he did? He killed all his brothers. Yeah, that was it was kind of interesting. I was looking at this. If you remember, it, Jehoshaphat, Jehoram's father, what do you do with all of Jehoram's brothers? Do you remember? What did Jehoshaphat do for them? It's down at Second Chronicles 11, down at verse 23. Where are all Jehoram's brothers in the kingdom of Judah? Look at verse 23. What does it say? Okay. Okay. This, by the way, if this sounds familiar, if you can remember, this is what Rehoboam did with all his sons. Why do you do that? Why would a king spread all his kids out to different cities and give them uh, little minor roles in the kingdom and authority? If you got a bunch of kids and you're king, why would you do something like that? Well, that's part of it. That's part of it for sure. To make sure that you got a friendly eye in each of the cities and know what's going on and somebody you can trust. That's definitely part of it. Well, that's a big part of it too. And particularly, and maybe not even so much Jehoshaphat specifically or Rehoboam specifically, but if Jehoshaphat has picked the son, Jehoram, he's going to be king, and that's what he says. He has decided that he's going to name his oldest Jehoram as king. Well, I've got all these brothers, and typically what happens when We saw this. Remember when David died, or David was about to die? What all was going on? You know, oh man, I'm saying off the top of my head now. I blank on his name. Abijah, is it or Ahijah? I can't remember. Oh, no, it's not Absalom. Absalom had already revolted, but this is another one. He was the oldest living son and decided to take claim on the throne, and he started maneuvering around and doing all this stuff. And David had to basically get up and tell everybody, "No, it's Solomon that's going to do it." So changing of the guard is never a neat thing. And so the idea is, if I can at least keep these guys happy and spread them out, to your point, to kind of keep them from ganging up, or to keep them away from the power, and make it sure that everybody understands that Jehoram, my oldest, is going to be my king. That theoretically should minimize the mess and should make for an easy and smooth transition. And so, from what we understand, Jehoram, he starts in 852. There is a apparently there was a excuse me, 853. There's supposedly about a 3-year period where he was co-regent with Jehoshaphat, his father. But when he gets on the throne, the first thing he does, as Stephen already said, is he goes out and kills all his brothers. So that tells you a little something about his character and his nature. That not it's not enough to be named king. I don't want to have anybody doubting that I'm the one in charge. I'm going to go out and kill everybody. Now, what kind of influence did he have in his life? Who was his primary influence? Would you say after Jehoshaphat? Who's he married to? Yeah, Athaliah. And of course, Athaliah was what she she's the daughter of Ahab and Jezebel. Uh, Jehoshaphat, the gift that keeps giving. Jehoshaphat, trying to have an alliance with Israel, decides to have his son marry Ahab's daughter, and the result is now he has Ahab's influence in his courtroom. And we'll see that Ahaziah becomes even a bigger deal for Judah, and a bigger problem when he gets to the throne. Because he's going to get to the throne. Jehoram is about 32 years old when he comes to the throne. He's a relatively mature man. He's already been co-regent. He's kind of knows what's going on. But when Ahaziah comes into the throne room, he's only 21 years old. And we read, in fact, if you look over in Second Chronicles 21, is it 21? 22, excuse me. In 22, verse 2, it says Ahaziah was 22 years old when he became king. He reigned 1 year in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Athaliah. He walked in the ways of the house of Ahab, for his mother gave him evil advice. This is the Christian standard, by the way. So he did what was evil in the Lord's sight, like the house of Ahab, for they were his advisors after the death of his father to his destruction. So Ahaziah is going to be in a situation where he's no longer, he's not married to one of Ahab's children, but it's his mother, and she's his main influence, and he's surrounded by advisors who are all essentially Ahab's people, and they're all advising him to basically go along with Israel. And so at this point, you've got Judah just kind of tagging along and following along with Israel, doing whatever they're going to do. And to this point, what they want to do is they want to continue in idolatry. They want to continue in the corruption that they've been involved in. And so Jehoram starts his reign. He's horrible. He's evil. Again, we talked about his nickname, Jehorrible, the easy way to remember him. And he gets a letter. Who's he get a letter from in Second Chronicles? He gets a letter from Elijah. There's some conversation about that, and there's a lot of discussion about what this means, because if you remember, if you take the book of Second Kings and look at it as a chronological account, Elijah's been gone for a while. And I suspect that most people would argue that by this time Elijah is probably dead, and that Elisha is probably the main prophet. Uh, so there's a lot of questions on whether Elijah is actually still alive, and it's just not clear in the scripture. Uh, Whether Elijah wrote this before he died, as a matter of prophecy, and sent it to Elijah, or if Elijah had told this to Elisha and Elisha had delivered it, or written it. There's some discussions about that, but people will sometimes go to that and say, well, wait a second, the chronology is out of order here in this section. But regardless, he gets a letter from Elijah of condemnation, and if you'll notice what he says, it's down in verse 12. of Second Chronicles 21. He says, because you have not walked in the ways of your father Jehoshaphat or in the ways of King Asa of Judah, but have walked in the ways of the kings of Israel, have caused Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem to prostitute themselves like the house of Ahab prostituted itself, and also have killed your brothers, your family's family, who were better than you. The Lord is now about to strike your people, your sons, your wives, and all your possessions with a horrible affliction. I read that and I wonder a little bit whether talked about how Jehoshaphat had scattered his other sons to other land, other cities, and I wonder if maybe outside of the influence in Jerusalem, where Athaliah was here and all the Ahab's people were here, I wonder if those guys maybe hadn't had the same corrupting influence of idolatry that Jehoram had, because Elijah said we would have been better off with any of those people, and you killed all of them. And so as a result of that, he is going to have a horrible affliction. And if you remember, how does it say that Jehoram died? Yeah. It's about as bad as you can. This is right up there with Herod dying of worms immediately in Acts 10 or Acts 9. I can't remember which one it is. But just a horrible way to die. And I always love the way they pronounce it in verse 20, where they say he was 32 years old when he became king. He reigned 8 years. He died to no one's regret and was buried in the city of David, but not in the tomb of the kings. That, by the way, we talked about Chronicles more so than Kings. You can learn a lot, I think, from the general disposition of somebody when you see how they were buried, how they were treated when they died. And it's interesting to me. We talk about it as corrupt as Judah was. I get the sense, especially in our reading today, that even in Israel, there were a lot of people that understood that things were not going the way they should be going, and were not really okay with some of the things that were going on from Ahab's reign and from Jehoram's reign. Here clearly nobody thought that this guy belonged in the same tomb as David or Jehoshaphat or any of the great kings that had come before. And so he is buried, but not, he's buried in the city of David, but not in the tombs of the kings. And that leads us to the next man. We really don't hear a lot about him because he doesn't last very long, and that's Ahaziah. He reigns for about 1 year roughly, and he's going to be the guy that's on the throne when all of this comes together, when God's judgment comes in the form of Jehu. So we see in if we go back to Second Kings, you've got the stories of the two anointings that take place. Uh, it's one of the saddest stories that it always affects me a little bit when I read it in Second Kings 8, when you see Elisha going to Hazael, who is a Syrian, and he's in Damascus. It's interesting when he goes there. Ben Hadad of Aram is sick. What does it say that the king of Aram or the king of Syria does when he hears that Elisha is in the city of Damascus? Chapter 8. Mhm. Yep. So you got the king of Syria, a pagan king, who says, I want to hear what God's servant has to say about this. Now, if you flash back to the beginning of First Kings or beginning of Second Kings, how this book starts, you got Ahaziah who falls through the lattice window. He's injured. Who does he inquire of? Who does he want to hear from? Not God. Ahaziah. This is Israel's Ahaziah, I should say. Yeah, go inquire of the god of Ekron, Beelzebub, one of the Philistine gods. So Israel's king is interested in hearing what somebody else has to say. And 7 chapters later, I don't think it's an accident that he makes a point of saying that the king of Syria, knowing who Elisha was, regarded him enough to go and ask of him what's going to happen. Because if you remember, when the king of Syria's um, experience with Elisha, when we read some of those stories from a week or two ago, you know, every time the king of Syria would go to try to attack Israel, what happened? You remember? How did the king of Israel always know where he was going? It's in chapter 6. Yeah, 2 Kings 6. By the way, the easiest way to I know we flip around a lot between these two books. Typically, if I'm giving a lot of details about Judah, it's going to be the Second Chronicles. If I'm giving a lot of details about Israel, it's probably going to be in Second Kings. That's not an absolute rule, but generally that's kind of what happens. If you remember what's going on, the Syrians are trying to be successful, and finally the king of Aram says he's just tired of it. He calls his people together in verse 11 and says, "Tell me which one of you is for the king of Israel." And what do they tell him? "Well, nobody's for you, but what's going on? Why is he failing?" It was the same verse 12. Okay, so that was in chapter 6. So so Syria is well aware of who Elisha is, and in fact, of course, later on we see Naaman going to Samaria to be healed. There have been a lot of interactions with Syria. They are well aware of Elisha, and so the king of Syria has a regard for him that the king of Israel doesn't. And so Hazael goes to meet Elisha, and basically Elisha tells him, yeah, he's going to recover, but he's actually going to die. And it says in verse 11, he stared steadily at him until he was ashamed, and the man of God wept. And as Hazael asked, "Why is my Lord weeping?" He said, "Because I know the evil you will do to the people of Israel. You will set their fortresses on fire. You will kill their young men with the sword. You will dash their children to pieces. You will rip open their pregnant women." And Hazael said, "How could your servant, a mere dog, do such a mighty deed?" And Elisha said, "The Lord has shown me that you will be king over Aram." And basically, it's we ask, how does God prophesy and then fulfill? Well, sometimes it's as simple as just putting the plan in motion and planting the seed in somebody's head. Because what does Hazael do now? How does Hazael become king? Yeah, he just goes and kills him in his room. Well, God said I was going to do it. That gave me the courage to go do it. And so now we got Hazael, who is going to be who's over Syria, and as time is going to go on, that's going to become a real. He's going to become more and more of an issue for Israel to deal with. Now, the second anointing takes place at the beginning of chapter 9, when Elisha goes and sends a prophet to anoint Jehu or as king over Israel. It's kind of interesting. The way the story goes is, I think, telling a little bit, because he tells him basically, go in, take your flask, get Jehu into another room, anoint him, and get out. Because clearly, you're going to anoint somebody else king over Israel when there's an actual sitting king over Israel. There's a good chance that that's not going to go over very well. But and what's the reaction of Jehu's fellow commanders when this happens? They see this prophet come in. They all know he's a prophet. He herds Jehu into another room and and just basically takes off immediately. And they all ask him, "Well, what's going on? What did he have to say?" What's Jehu's first response? Yeah, just people say stuff, just usual stuff. And by the way, what do they notice what they called him? Um, what the uh, what the other soldiers called the prophet? This mad fellow. What did that crazy guy have to say? So they press him. No, no, no. Tell us what it is. And he finally says, "Well, he's told me that I'm going to be king over Israel." What's the response of the people around him? Yeah, they're all for it. Which tells you one of two things, and maybe both, that either they really liked Jehu, which is very possible, because I think that comes out that he seems to be a very charismatic man. He seems to be a very forceful man and a strong leader. It might be that they just hated Ahab's family, which is also very possible, because you see a lot of that coming out. When Jehu keeps asking people who's on my side, you don't hear a lot of people standing up and saying, "No, I'm staying with the king." Basically, everybody just falls in line with what he's doing. And that's especially true when we get to the story of Jezebel. Because how does Jezebel die? Do you remember? He comes to Jezreel. Jezebel, of course, basically decides to be dignified and goes out to meet him. She's standing up in the window, and what does Hazael do? He's standing down below her and does what? Yeah. Yeah, who's for me? And two or three of her eunuchs, which would be her most trusted servants, advisors, whatever you want to call them, they say, "Yeah, that's me." Okay, throw her out the window, and they just do it. Which again tells you that it's ironic to me that Jezebel is being recast by a lot of progressives as some sort of feminist hero, but clearly nobody seemed to like her very much. Even the people that were worshippers of Baal, she didn't have a lot of friends around her, and certainly not enough to save her life. So anyway, so we see Jehu really kind of gathering people to him pretty easily as he goes through this process. Let's see where I want to go with this. I'll make sure I didn't skip something I wanted to talk about. So Jehu, let's go back to Jehu. He's been anointed. He's in Ramoth Gilead, and he is now going to go take care. As it happens, he's able to take care of both the king of Israel and the king of Judah. Now, is he told? This is kind of something I hadn't really thought about. But is Jehu ever told to kill the king of Judah, Ahaziah? What is the mandate that Jehu is given to end the line of Ahab? Now, if I'm a Jew or if I'm an Israelite in that time, where does the line go through? Who how does the line progress? Through the son, yeah. Through Ahaziah, then through Jehoram. Does it does Ahab lines go through his daughter? Not usually, right? Now, I may be stretching a little bit here, but I want I think what you start to see is that Jehu, when we're to look at who Jehu is and what he does, uh, would you say that Jehu goes a little too far? You don't think so? How so? Yeah, yeah. Well, and I mean, and I may be wrong about this, and I may be overstepping that a little bit. This may have been completely in line with what God wanted him to do. Now, Ahaziah was the anointed, the actual anointed of Judah. He was of the line of David. Uh, and it may very well be that Jehu thought exactly what you're saying. Look, he is tainted by Ahab. Anybody connected with Ahab needs to die. And frankly, if anybody, certainly the king Ahaziah absolutely deserved to die. Uh, but at the same time, typically speaking, you don't see God calling for one of his anointed as a seed of David to be wiped out. Typically, they may get assassinated within their own household. I think that happens maybe once or twice, but very rarely. Even the worst ones typically come to a relatively peaceful end. Their line continues. But what Jehu does though is he doesn't just stop there. How does he kills Ahab? I kills Ahab. He kills Jehoram. He kills Ahaziah at the same time, of course, because Ahaziah has come down to visit him. He'd heard Jehoram was sick. He'd been wounded in battle. He kills both of them, and the next step for him then is to kill who? Who's next on the, if you want to say, the hit list? Uh huh. Yep. Yeah. So that's the next step. And by the way, this is also very much in line with what God told him to do. He said, I want you to wipe out the line of Ahab. And it's interesting how he does this. Did you notice? One of the things about Jehu that strikes me is he's a very smart guy, and he's very much of a politician. Um, because he knows where all the sons are. They're all in Samaria, and so he sends a message to the elders in the city of Samaria. Samaria, and what does he tell them to do? Well, he does, but before that, even at the very beginning, at the beginning of chapter 10, uh, when he first sends a message in verse 2, notice what he says. In other words, all right, we, yeah, we all know who's supposed to be in charge now. I killed him. His son's up. If you want him on the throne, you put him on the throne. And what's the response to that? We're not doing that. No, you win. We get the message, as he says, we're your servants. We'll do whatever you tell us to do. And he tells them in verse 6, if you're on my side, and this is what you're reading, if you'll obey me, bring the heads of your master's sons at this time tomorrow at Jezreel. Somebody, one of the commentaries I read made a point that the language in this verse is actually uh, a little less clear than how it's written as we read it. I mean, when we read this, it's very clear. Cut off all their heads, bring them to me. Apparently, the language that he actually used kind of implies it, but doesn't actually outright says it. So, in other words, it leaves him the room that if somebody accuses him of saying, "How could you have these people beheaded?" He's, "Look, I just said bring them. I didn't say cut their heads off. They did that." And notice what he says when they bring the heads out in verse 9. He tells the people, "You are innocent. It was I who conspired against my master and killed him. But who struck all these down? Know then that not a word that the Lord spoke against the house of Ahab will fail, for the Lord has done what he promised through his servant Elijah." His point there is, look, all right, you're all in now. If there was any doubt about whose side you're on, you've committed. You just killed 70 of his sons, so I don't want to hear anybody complaining about me, overstepping my bounds. He's basically forced the people of Samaria and the leaders of Samaria to pick a side. He's a smart guy in terms of the way he's doing this. And now he takes it a step farther though, because we read where is it down in it's 15 and 16. Well, let's talk about that first, and we'll get down to that because I want to bring up Jehonadab. This is actually an interesting story. Does anybody? Well, I'm not going to ask. I wouldn't know who Jehonadab is if I hadn't looked him up. About 230 years later, after this story, we read about Jehonadab, and we learn something very interesting about him. As you read this, it says he found Jehonadab, son of Rahab, coming to meet him. He says, "Is your heart one with mine?" And he gets him into gets him into the chariot and says, "Come with me and see my zeal for the Lord." In other words, here's a man that I know you're going to appreciate what I'm about to do for God. Because there's something we learn about Jehonadab, and if you want to look over in Jeremiah chapter 35, this is, like I said, about 230 years later, this name is going to come up again. It says in verse 35, the word that came to Jeremiah from the Lord in the day of Jehoiakim, son of Josiah, king of Judah. This is when Judah is in its death spiral. It's headed downhill. There's no redeeming it at this point. Go to the house of the Rechabites and speak with them and bring them to the house of the Lord into one of the chambers and then offer them wine to drink. So I took Jaazaniah, the son of Jeremiah, son of Habazaniah, and his brothers and all his sons and the whole house of the Rechabites. I brought them to the house of the Lord into the chamber of the sons of Hanan, the son of Igdaliah, the man of God, which was near the chamber of the officials, above the chamber of Maaseiah, the son of Shallum, keeper of the threshold. And I set before the Rechabite pitchers full of wine and cups, and I said to them, "Drink wine." But they answered, "We will drink no wine, for Jonadab, the son of Rechab, our father, commanded us, You shall not drink wine, neither you nor your sons forever. You shall not build a house, you shall not sow seed, you shall not plant or have a vineyard, but you shall live in tents all your days, that you may live many days in the land where you sojourn. We have obeyed the voice of Jonadab, the son of Rechab, our father, in all that he commanded us, to drink no wine all our days, ourselves, our wives, our sons, or our daughters, and not to build a house to dwell in. We had no vineyards or field or seeds, but we have lived in tents and have obeyed and done all that Jonadab our father commanded us. So, and God, and the word of the Lord in verse 12 comes to Jeremiah. Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, go and say to the people of Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem, will you not receive instruction and listen to my words, declares the Lord? The command that Jonadab the son of Rechab gave to his sons to drink no wine has been kept, and they drink none to this day, for they have obeyed their father's command. I have spoken to you persistently, but you have not listened to me. I want to bring that up for a couple of reasons. One, because when we get here in Jeremiah, we'll refresh our memory on this and you'll remember. But think about what he's saying. For 230 years, this man and his family now have had an ultra conservative, ultra strict idea of how to serve God. Not everybody in Israel was off doing idolatry. They were really trying their best to serve God in the way that they believed that they needed to serve God. Now, I don't know if they were doing anything else right, but they had a zeal for God. And he says for 230 years they haven't varied from that. I can't get you people to go one generation without turning away. And the idea, he's going to use them as an example. This is the kind of faithfulness that God wants from you, that you have refused to give. And so we're going to see this name come back up again, you know, 230 years later or so in Judah. But for now, he's already gained this reputation because Jehu wants him on. You know, would it be fair to say that Jehu has some sort of a zeal for God? Yeah, I think so. I mean, there's at least some sort of a zeal, or at the very least, he wants people to believe he has zeal for God, because he does all the things that you would want. You know, God told me to wipe out Ahab, and I have completely wiped out Ahab. In fact, this is what I was looking for, and I forget where the exact verse is, but not only does he wipe out Ahab, he wipes out all his friends. He wipes out all his associates. He basically, it's like the Godfather. He just anybody that he's ever known, I'm going to go in and wipe all of them out. And now he's decided I'm going to take out the Baal worshippers. And again, this probably is well within God's mandate. I love how he phrases this in verse 18. He tells them, he sends out a letter. Ahab served Baal a little, Jehu will serve him a lot. We're just going to double down on our Baal worship. Everybody come. Anybody who wants to worship Baal, come on down to the temple, and we're going to have a big sacrifice. And so, long and short, he basically gets everybody in, makes sure all the worshipers of Jehovah are out, and then he goes in and wipes them all out. So Jehu does all the stuff that God has told him to do. Uh, but what do we read about Jehu after he's done that? There's two issues that he has. One of them I've already mentioned to. God said wipe out this much, and Jehu takes that as a license to go kill a lot more people than he probably should have. Second thing though is what? What did he not do? Yeah. hmm he didn't go all the way. And now we're never told, and in fact, I don't know that we read of any of the kings in First Kings or First or Second Kings where God sends prophets after Jeroboam to tell them to stop doing this. But I think the implication is pretty clear that that's been a constant message. You need to turn away from these things. So when we think about the zeal of Jehu, maybe we qualify his zeal. When was Jehu most zealous for doing God's will? I guess there's a couple of ways to look at this, depending on how you think of Jehu. Yeah, when he got to kill people, I would like to think that he wasn't just a guy that liked to kill people. Maybe he was, but maybe more charitable is that he liked to do God's will when God told him things that were good for him, that would help him to establish his throne, that would help to make him stable, and the things that he needed to do. In a lot of ways, he basically no different than Jeroboam, no different. You go all the way back to Saul, who obeyed God when it was convenient to obey God, but wasn't willing to do the things because he's enjoying a lot of popularity, or at least people are following him anyway. They may be afraid not to follow him, but he's got everybody in line. He's doing everything the way he wants it done. Now, if I go in and shake everything up and tell everybody to start going to Jerusalem to worship again, I'm maybe that's asking a little bit too much of me. I just got into this job. I need to make sure that I'm secure, and I just don't know that you don't know what's really going through his mind, but I suspect that a pragmatic politician at this point does what Jeroboam does. He makes a business decision and says, if I get rid of this, I'm going to lose my power. I'm going to lose my authority. And so as a result of that, um, it's very similar to what we read with Ahab, except he says, because you have done, God says in verse 30, because you have done well in carrying out what is right in my sight, and you have done the house of Ahab all that was in my heart, 4 generations of your sons will sit on the throne of Israel. Yet Jehu was not careful to follow the instructions of the Lord God of Israel with all his heart. He did not turn from the sins that Jeroboam had caused Israel to commit. And you see in the next verse the penalty for that. In his days, the Lord began to reduce the size of Israel. Hazael defeated the Israelites throughout their territory from the Jordan eastward, the whole land of Gilead, the Gadites, the Reubenites, the Manassites, from Aroer, which is the Arnon Valley, through Gilead and Bashan. I've got that up in a map. Uh, by the way, if you'll notice the asterisk, that's Jehu's line. So you've got Jehu, you've got his son Jehoahaz, you've got his son Jehoash, and then you've got his son Jeroboam the second. And then in 753, Zechariah, Jeroboam the second son, is the one who's going to get assassinated. And so 4 generations, his line stays on. But then when that comes apart, you can see that's when the chaos really starts to ensue. Basically, Israel's kingship just becomes a confusing mess. And from that point on, if I remember right, we don't read any more. We don't read any more overtures for them to come back to the law. We don't read about them going after Baal, but they just keep doing what they're doing. And as a result of that, eventually, that's going to lead to 723 when they're taken into captivity and they're dispersed. So this I wanted to bring up. I think that that Luke alluded to this when he was here. This is the obelisk of Shalmaneser. This is Shalmaneser was one of the kings of Assyria. And I'll click this so you can read a little bit more. If you'll notice, 858 to 824, we're getting pretty close to his timeline now, and it doesn't mention this here, but we do see that one of the kings that's mentioned is Jehu of the house of Omri, king of Israel. So this is one of the earliest where we start to see concrete historical evidence that these people that we're reading about were actual people. They were documented, and in fact, what we see is a picture of Jehu coming in prostration to Shalmaneser and bringing gifts, which tells you that basically what happened was when 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 the king started to come in, Jehu's power got whittled away, probably to the point where he was essentially not much more than a vassal king over Israel. So those problems are and they're very well documented. He mentions the document says, or the piece says, it depicts Jehu in a short sleeved fringed robe with a belt, slouched conical hat. Since he likely would not have been dressed in the finest robes when appearing as a captive, these represent simpler everyday garments. So you've got a king who is now, ironically, who thought he was going to achieve this great power, but because God was not with him, he only got so far as doing what God wanted him to do. And after that, he started to fail. Now, what this does not mention, by the way, is that Shalmaneser also mentions Hazael, and he calls him the son of a nobody. And when you call somebody the son of a nobody in that culture, especially when it was a king, what that typically meant was that you assassinated the other king and took his job. So again, it's an example of archaeological relics backing up the story that we find in the Bible. So everything we see, lines up with what we find historically. I just want to show you the map real quick to show you, and I know Jim's up here, so I'll finish this up and give it over to you. Um, this is obviously east of the Jordan River. The Jordan River is right here, and so you start getting up into Bashan, Manasseh, Gilead, Gad, Reuben, all these areas that have been populated by Israel off and on pretty much since they came into the land. And now Syria is going to go ahead and take all of this. You see, by the way, there's Damascus. By the way, if you ever want to know why Syria and Israel don't get along very well, there's Damascus, and Israel is basically right here. So they're literally right next to each other. And if you go up to the Golan Heights, you look down the hill, and there's Israel, which is why people keep wanting to launch rockets from up there, and that's why Israel doesn't want to give up the Golan Heights. So anyway, so that's kind of an overview of what we got. Oh, by the way, I did want to tell you what that picture was. Um, this picture is taken outside of Jezreel. This is the Jezreel Valley, just outside of Jezreel. And this patch of ground right here is an area that's right below the ruins of his palace in Jezreel. And so I like to at least speculate That's Naboth's vineyard right there. No, it's separate from Samaria. It's a different. It's down the valley from Samaria. Yeah, we did. It just wasn't very. It wasn't very remarkable. There wasn't really a whole lot there. Samaria's was much bigger and a lot more removed. Jezreel was a much. Uh, there really wasn't a whole lot going on, but they had enough to show. Yes, this is where it was, and probably somewhere around in this area, you can imagine Ahab looking out his window over the valley, and man, wouldn't it be great to have that vineyard that's right there, right outside my window, and you know. So as a result of that, Jezebel allows him to take it. So I apologize. I meant I have questions ready and I forgot to print them out before I left. So I will get them out to you. If not by email, then for sure I'll print them out for Sunday. So thanks everybody, and we will. I'll turn it over to Jim, and I'll shut off the live stream.